Welcome to Women's Sports Weekly, where women's sports happen every day, but we talk about it once a week. I'm Carolyn.
And I'm Danielle. Women's Sports Weekly is a podcast where we discuss the latest news, explore interesting stories, and share our love for women's sports. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Women's Sports Weekly Pod. Follow us and rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Send us an email at womensportsweeklypod@gmail.com, and we may feature your email on our Listeners Experience Zone, the Les.
We have a really special interview this week with Ellie Roscher and Dr. Baeth, the authors of Fair Game, Trans Athletes, and the Future of Sports. Right now, there are two cases with the Supreme Court related to trans bans in sports in West Virginia and Idaho, and it is expected that the Supreme Court will make a decision by spring or early summer of this year. We really encourage you to listen to this episode and read Fair Game because it lays out so many stats and information while also sharing personal stories from trans athletes. I think no matter what, every single one of us can benefit from learning a bit more and learning about the humans affected by laws like this.
For sure. I really enjoyed this interview. I really enjoyed getting to know the authors, and I hope everyone just has an open mind as they're listening and maybe even buys the book.
Before we get into the interview, let's get into some updates.
Starting with Run Club. We have Run Club this Thursday and every Thursday at the 99ers Sports Bar. We meet at the bar at 6 p.m., run 3 miles, and then enjoy friends, beers, and good conversation afterwards. Each week we have a secret word, and if you share the secret word with the bartenders, you will get 50% off your first draft. This week's word is
fair game.
Fair game.
2 words.
It is 2 words.
We also need to take this time to ask you to please rate and subscribe to our podcast. We love to do this. We love putting this podcast together. We want to continue to do it. We want to continue interviewing amazing people like the interview you're about to hear. So please, if you want to support us, rate, subscribe, give us a positive review, and share this podcast with people you love. Thank you to everyone who has rated the podcast 5 stars. If you send us a screenshot of your 5-star rating, we will send you a Women's Sports Weekly sticker. Let's get into this interview. Ellie Roscher and Dr. Baeth join Women's Sports Weekly today to discuss their book, Fair Game, Trans Athletes, and the Future of Sports. Ellie Roscher is an author who also teaches writing and yoga in Minneapolis. She was a 2-sport college athlete competing in gymnastics and softball and went on to coach at the rec club and high school levels. Ellie holds an MFA in writing from Sarah Lawrence College and an MA in theology from Luther Seminary. Dr. Baeth is a feminist scholar whose work explores the gendering of sports spaces, the moving body, and sports' cultural role in social movements. A collegiate coach, educator, and storyteller, Dr. Baeth was a 2-sport athlete at Swarthmore College. She holds an MS in exercise science and sports studies from Smith College and a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Ellie and Baeth, to Women's Sports Weekly.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
We are so excited to have you on today. I am so thrilled that Fair Game was the first book that I completed in 2026. It was so interesting and amazing to read, and we have a lot of questions for you, so let's get into it. When reading Fair Game, the most impactful sections of the book for me were the interview with trans athletes. Can you tell us more about the choice to feature trans athletes so much at the center of this book, and then how you found everyone to interview?
Yes. Okay, I'll do the first part, Baeth, and then you can jump in. I am obsessed with narrative power, the power of stories, the power of telling the story of your body, how that can change you, and then when you share it, how that can change society. Baeth did a media poll, and we saw that in articles about trans athletes, less than 8% mention a trans athlete and less than 2% quote a trans athlete. So we were talking about trans athletes without talking to them. So the main goal of Fair Game, this project, was to let trans athletes tell their own stories. And as a cis athlete, I was fascinated to sit at their feet and say, tell me the long version. What is it like to be in your body? What is it like to be an athlete for you? You know, what was your journey? How is it to navigate a decidedly cis sports world? And I learned so much. So that was honestly like goal number one, low hanging fruit. We need to start talking to trans athletes if we're going to be talking about them. And so this project absolutely changed my life because I listened hard to those stories. And I'm going to nerd out a little bit more on this and just say that our society believes in stories that are not true. And one of the stories that we're believing right now is that it's unfair and unsafe for trans athletes to compete with and against cis athletes. And no matter how much data and research Dr. Baeth was throwing at that story, it wasn't shifting at all. And so we decided to collaborate and say, can we use the best data and research that we have at this moment, which we can talk more about why that is lacking, right? But the best we have at this moment, and couple that with allowing trans athletes to share their own stories and see what happens. Can we tell a new story to get out of the one we're stuck in right now that I see as pretty limiting and pretty harmful? Baeth, do you want to talk about the process a little bit?
I would love to. So I'm cisgender. I started this work because I started working for an LGBTQ rights organization. And all of a sudden, as the researcher on staff, I was getting all of these questions about trans athletes. I had to do a lot of work and a lot of homework to learn about trans athletes. But more importantly, in working with that organization, I had access to trans athletes like nobody else I knew in my life. You know, when I tell people what I do, I mention it on an airplane or whatever, I invariably get asked, okay, well, what do you think about trans athletes and trans women athletes? And honestly, one of my first responses is, okay, well, have you ever met a trans athlete? Like, I am definitely interested in engaging in this conversation. But most people say no. Part of why we wrote this book was to say, hey, let's introduce you to some trans athletes. You just need to know that these are people who are out in the world. And then in terms of finding them, we were so lucky. So we put out a call. We said, hey, we want to interview trans athletes. I was like, Ellie, I think maybe if we get like 6 people, I'm going to be really happy with that. No, we heard from like 60 people in 2 weeks. And not only that, when we started this project, we were like, okay, we're going to interview trans adults because it's a lot easier in terms of research. As soon as we put the call out, I started getting calls from families and kids saying, hey, I want to talk about my story. I want to tell you my story. And we're like, how can we not listen? How can we not hear this? We were pretty lucky. The stories that these athletes have shared are just so resonant with my own experiences as an athlete and as a human.
I'm so happy that you were able to get people under 18 to share their story, because there's such an important distinction between professional sports and recreation sports and how that can really impact a person's life. And to hear directly from the kids was just really, really incredible. So I'm so happy that we have that in this book. So thank you.
Yeah. I also love the perspective you provided of like when you start doing the research, you just all of a sudden get all these questions, and you were an athlete. So just being in women's sports in general, I know we get those questions, and especially since we started the podcast. And I like how you take it back to the question of, have you met a trans athlete? Because I feel as though when I get that question, I'm on the defensive end of like, I don't even know how to describe how I feel towards it to people. Like, yes, I do believe they belong in sport, but sometimes it's hard to explain why, because it's like you just feel anger that the question is even being asked. And I think it's helpful to know, how do you answer this question in a way that will maybe try to help other people understand?
And I do think there is an invitation there when there are assumptions embedded in the question. So when I feel locked onto my heels and I see kind of that clinging in the body of the person asking, that's now happened to me often enough where it's like an invitation to pause, take a breath, kind of feel into the assumptions of the question that's being asked, of like what's not being said. And I think part of the work for Baeth and I is figuring out what better questions are, modeling that, and then inviting especially cis folks to do their homework and catch up and ask better questions, ask more interesting questions that don't have assumptions embedded in them. It's like, let's have a better conversation about this. One way to have a better conversation is to have trans athletes be a part of the conversation. One way to have a better conversation is to infuse it with good information. And then one way to have a good conversation is to be asking questions that get at the heart of what we're talking about, that like open things up instead of shut things down. So when I feel shut down by a question, that's always just like, oh, okay, what's the other question here? What's the question behind the question? What can we talk about what we're really talking about? Right? All the questions that people are asking about fairness and safety are questions we absolutely have to be asking, but we're going to be having a more compassionate and interesting conversation about it.
I love how in the book you take these myths and you line them up in each chapter. And it's like, here's the myth and here's us deconstructing that myth for you. And I want to get a little bit more now into this idea of sex testing, because we've seen it evolve over time. And right now, testosterone is like the hot way to measure sex, especially in women. So can you take that myth of measuring testosterone and can you talk about the issues with measuring testosterone and what it means for athletes within the sports space?
Yes. First, I think there is no one way to verify that somebody is a woman or a man. If you talk to any high-level scientist, there have been, I think, 6 different iterations of how we've tried to test this. Nothing works, right? Bodies are simply more complicated than that. Now, when we talk specifically about testosterone, there are a few points that I like to raise about this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the higher level points, and then I want to talk about what this means on a granular level too. So when we look at testosterone, you look at how testosterone has been measured, and particularly the rates of testosterone in male athletes versus female athletes, or athletes who compete in those categories. There is overlap. Most people will say if you have a certain threshold, then you must be a man. That's not true. You can look at the studies, they're in the book. But beyond that, the idea of testing just one variable to determine something as complicated as, say, somebody's sex or, frankly, their athletic ability is a little bit laughable to me, right? Like, I find it fascinating that we talk about how much testosterone is circulating in somebody's blood, but we don't talk about testosterone receptors in those same bodies, right? Like that doesn't really make sense. And then beyond that, if we're talking about the granular level and why this is hard, testosterone levels fluctuate throughout the day and they fluctuate throughout a lifetime and they fluctuate based on all sorts of other variables. So the idea that somebody has just like a set amount of testosterone also just, it doesn't make any sense. It's just not how bodies work. And I don't think that's how sport should work.
And I'm going to jump in with the narrative. We have a story about testosterone in our society, and the story is not accurate. The story is that testosterone is male and that it's synonymous with a certain type of strength, and that bodies with more testosterone are superior to bodies with less. Like those are all stories that we're just deeply committed to in our society. I just respect Dr. Baeth so much for going and doing real research about testosterone and how it plays in the body and how it plays in terms of athletic performance. And I think we just need to also name which bodies get researched and which don't. One of the reasons that we don't have good information about this is because we don't historically have not cared about the female body or trans bodies. So we don't have good information. We don't have information about what testosterone does in the body of a trans athlete over a career, over a sports career. And so when folks are asking what the science says, they're not getting the answer that they want because they want the answer to confirm their bias. And the data we have is just not doing that testosterone levels do not equally equate with athletic performance. It is not a male hormone, and it does not make an athletic body superior. It just doesn't. To me, that's such exciting news that sex is incredibly interesting and complex, and that my body is. And guess what? So is sport. So can we have a more nuanced, more interesting conversation about those complex things? And I'm just going to circle back and say, when Dr. Baeth said we weren't going to interview children, it was because that was going to make it easier. Well, that comes up with testosterone too, right? It's not about what's easier or cleaner or simpler. So you have scientists saying it would be easier to do tests with 2 buckets, male, female, with very clean edges, but that's not how bodies work. When we look at sex, when we look at testosterone, we have this more of a bimodal, like the 2 camel hump thing with an incredible amount of variance. That makes testing and research extremely difficult. But when you do the difficult thing, you do get better information. And we're learning so much about sex that the science has a lot of catching up to do with that. Tests used to be run with 2 static ideas of what a male and a female are. That is not accurate, is not giving us good data.
I think one of the main things that stood out to me when reading the book was there's more difference among men and among women than there are when you compare the two. That blew my mind. As someone who is like, I support trans participation in sports, and I was like, I have my own biases, right? I have my own like patriarchy that I'm working in that I need to break down. And so that really was such an important piece for me to read. So I want to get in a little bit more to the research of it all, because there are limited studies on women and trans athletes. So would you like to see more studies? I think the answer is yes. And if so, what should we be looking at?
Yes, absolutely. I would love to see so many more studies on women, first and foremost, because ostensibly cis women make up half, a little bit more than half the population. So yeah, wouldn't it make sense that half of our research might cover them? Now, when it comes to trans athletes, so yes, I want to see more research, but I don't want to see research like it's being done right now. And by that, I mean, I think the idea of studying athletes as just bodies that perform doesn't make sense. Right? We know that bodies, they win championships or competitions, but there are so many other factors, right? Like how you're socialized, internal dialogue. We don't talk about that. And I find it stunning. There's an amazing scholar, Blair Hamilton, who's talked about this too, about muscle retention in trans women, and how one of the theories is that if you don't want to retain muscle because it doesn't align with your gender, your body won't do it as well. Right? You're going to make decisions that are different. So I would love to see more studies. I would love to see more interdisciplinary and dynamic studies. I say all this, but I also need to say that the reality is there will not be research on trans athletes in future. There could be. But when we look at the research that is out there, it's incredibly limited. And I don't think there will be a major influx of money or resources or, frankly, scientists and scholars who are incredibly well educated on this topic to be able to do really great research. So there's that. The other part of this is, given what has happened in the United States over the last few years, there aren't very many trans kids who are allowed to participate in sport right now. Mm-hmm. They're not going to grow up to be trans adults in sport. So I don't even know who we would study or who we would even interview about these experiences. And that is incredibly disheartening for me, incredibly sad.
I'll just add that I think that this is one place where cis women and trans women can come together in solidarity. I think that a lot of cis women I know would benefit with better information about hormones and our bodies, for example. Right. So starting to see these touch points of who is being researched and who isn't and why. And instead of falling for this move where we're going to pit cis women and trans women against each other, we could be pooling that energy toward a future where all bodies are advocated for. And we are having a more interesting conversation about hormones, for example, and gender affirming healthcare, how wide that goes, reproductive healthcare. It's so intertwined. And I think that this is one point that's really important where we could come together and fight like hell and all benefit together from that. That's where I get sad when we're losing steam in the wrong direction, pointing fingers at the wrong folks instead of getting really, really clear on what the work is, how the systems have to shift, and that we all have to come together if it's going to work to bring it down.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've seen funding decrease for research across the board in the US, but we have seen others step up. Michelle Kang comes to mind of pouring into women's research. And so I would love if we could find ways on top of exploring injury among athletes in women's sports, we should also be researching trans inclusion and what that looks like. Those pathways to participation that you talk about, which I think is great. Maybe that's a pathway, but yeah, it is disheartening to think that there's not a lot of research dollars going around, and it doesn't feel like the time because of all the ways that we're moving backwards.
And I do think money is so often left out of this conversation. When there's talk about policing the female category, that is going to take money. It's going to take time and money to maintain the female category. And that time and money could go into building a more beautiful sports future where more bodies get to play.
And that definitely brings us nicely into the next question. Can you describe how sports participation can be beneficial for any person who plays, especially trans people? And can you also describe how trans participation in sports can be beneficial for cis women?
Of course. I think it's important to say that sport can go either way. We've seen examples of sport not benefiting people, and we've seen a lot of examples of it benefiting. I personally have benefited from it. What we know is when we look at general research, people and kids who participate in sport are physically healthier, they're more confident, they have higher levels of self-esteem, their mental health is better. And so for me, when I'm thinking about, okay, if we did sports really well, of course, I want all kids to have access to that. But something that we talk a lot about, and that I think it's important to highlight here, is who gets access not just to sport, but who gets access to their bodies. In the United States in particular, we look at kids and how much access they have to their bodies. I mean, I think about me as a little kid sitting in school. I couldn't sit in my chair I can barely sit in my chair now for like an hour, right? So I loved PE. I loved recess. I loved sport. And when I look at the education system right now, we're losing PE. And the only people who get to play in sport generally are people who can afford to play in sport. So I think the question of what are the benefits, for me, it's about who gets to access their body, to be in tune with their body, to know their body, and to be empowered in that process. Beyond that, in terms of trans participation and inclusion, what we know is that in states that have trans inclusive policies, cisgender girls also report better experiences with sport. They're more likely to stay in sport, and they're generally more confident in sport. And so again, I mean, this really raises some questions of, are we protecting cis girls if we're banning trans athletes? When really what we know is if you put in protective policies, if you create the systems of inclusion where we do sport really well, we can focus on what some people think really matters in sport. For me, it's having access to our bodies and learning to love our bodies. Yeah, let's have better policies.
Yeah, I just want to highlight a few beautiful stories from the book. I'm thinking about Finley is a trans woman, tennis player and cyclist. And she said the first time she picked up a tennis racket at age 7, there was a part of her that knew that it would save her life. And it did. So she was growing up in what she describes as a low-level cult in the projects, and she would just hit the tennis ball against the brick wall for hours, right? Until somebody noticed how good she was. Tennis was a place for her to be safe, to be in her body. As a trans person, she did struggle a lot with mental health and suicidal thought, and it was that tennis racket that kept her here. She was clear. And then the thing that she describes is she did decide late in life that she was going to do some medical transitions as gender affirming healthcare. And she said when she went out to play tennis, more aligned in her body, the way she describes it, she said the white noise fell away. And so that moment I had this surge of my cis privilege, that being cis for me is arguably an athletic advantage because I did not have the white noise. I was not doing gymnastics to keep alive, and Finley was. So that gets at like how important it is. If movement is medicine for people, how dare we remove that tool as an option? And then also, can we work for more bodies to be able to move and play and get collective liberation in alignment with how they identify in the world, right? And for so many of these athletes, it's very low stakes sport. So why wouldn't we support saving lives, right? I think about Robin, who was one of our younger participants, maybe the youngest, I think age 8. She was no longer, as a trans girl in her state, able to participate in the sport that she loved. And so one of her teachers started an unofficial running club, because when it was unofficial, then Robin could move her body with her peers. Okay, so that teacher's a hero. But seriously, we have to make this move. And running was not Robin's thing, but she's in the running club because she wants to move with her peers. It's so important for young people to have a place where they feel like they belong. And I think especially for trans kids and trans people, because navigating the cis society is extremely exhausting and requires more and more vigilance for them to feel safe. So for me, belonging is a body feel. It's when my body knows that I belong, it's synonymous for me of feeling safe. I can drop into my body. I'm not looking over my shoulder. I'm not in survival mode. And I can experience movement as medicine then. And I just think that's a human right. And so I think it's especially important that we're working for trans kids, for trans adults to have that opportunity to belong and feel safe and drop into their bodies. I think about Lennox, D1 soccer player, who talked about when they played soccer, the gender and sex bullshit just dropped away. And they just got to be a body moving. They just got to be an athlete. And it was a release valve for them. But they also were the one that said when they came out even to themselves, before they started telling other people, they started playing better.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, again, talking about this, like the cis privilege in terms of performance, right? That when they were in alignment, even internally, their game picked up, which I just think is fascinating. So let's have multiple nuanced conversations that is creating more pathways for more bodies to play.
It's so interesting because feeling safe, I don't think people realize how often they are just normally feel safe in their body, right? You don't realize it until you feel unsafe. To feel unsafe in your body, there's really nothing else you can do except try to address your safety, right? How can I make myself get out of this situation or anything else? And it's like, how do you ever focus on anything else if you feel unsafe in your body? And I hope that people can hear that, because if you don't feel safe in your body, you can't be the best player out there ever. So that's a great point. I also think it was mentioned in the book, and I for so long thought sports has gotten better because technology has kept up and all of these other things. And then you all made really great points that sports got better when people of color were allowed to play in sports. Sports got better when women were allowed to play in sports. It actually brought everyone else up and made them step up their game. I was like, wow, I was just pointing to technology, and like, no, actually Title IX and that getting passed opened up this whole thing. And not only was it good for women's sports, but it was good for men's sports too. Like, everyone got better. And why do we not want to see the best athletes out there? So I just wanted to give you some kudos there as well.
Yeah, I think these stories are so important. And for me, it pulls the empathetic side of trying to put myself in their shoes and not even being able to imagine how those kids or trans adults feel when something like that is taken away from them. How do we share these stories with people who don't necessarily aren't on the same side and don't agree with them?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks who are starting to catch on a little bit, but feel behind and don't want to step in it. And so I really actually do believe in the book as a tool, because I've done this before, and it is an amazing gift to be able to hand someone who's a little skeptical but curious and let them be in the comfort of their own home, talking about safety, right? Underneath their favorite blanket with their favorite mug of tea, taking the information in on their own time. There can be a softening there. I often say in writing books, I've chosen the slow art. And one of the things that the anti-trans movement is using to their advantage is speed. It's so fast. And sometimes speed does harm, right? And so there's something about a book where somebody who's curious and has questions and is a little scared if their questions are okay can take information in, put the book down, pick it back up, do some homework, do some catching up before they come back to the conversation. So that's one of the ways I'm thinking about the book as a tool. Is it's different than having a face-to-face conversation with someone where someone can shut down right away and get defensive. Cis folks have so much catching up to do. It's like, how can we find folks who are a little bit curious, a little bit warm and open, and say, hey, read this book and let's chat about it, right? So it's like, then we're talking about an inanimate object outside of our bodies. And can we stay warm and open? Can we stay in our bodies as we're having this conversation? And when we're talking about fairness and we're talking about safety, we're asking cis folks like us to really explore their own stories. When we say the locker room is unsafe, a lot of people are going to cling because the locker room felt unsafe to them. So let's tell our cis stories about the locker room, come together with trans folks to make locker rooms safer for everybody, right? But it's like it works when folks are bringing their own bodies, their own experience, their own stories to the table. It's so easy when we think we're talking about other people, but we're talking about all of us. Like, we're all connected. And so any way you can kind of keep folks tapped into their own story and how that's interacting with the issue, the better. One of my hopes for the book is that it's a format where folks can engage at the speed that they're capable of at this moment, and that more of us can come together around it to have more compassionate conversation.
I want to switch gears just a little bit here. Danielle and I have played in an ABCD league, an anyone but cis dudes league, and it was awesome. We loved it. And we have also played in co-ed leagues where a certain amount of women had to be on the field, and Danielle has affectionately said that she felt like a Make-A-Wish kid. Like, she felt like she was just out there because they felt bad for her. So in the book, you all speak a little bit about desegregating men's and women's sports. Can you describe more of what that could look like and how it could be beneficial? And I asked that with some of my own stuff coming in of like, I don't know if I really want to play with cis dudes.
These are times when I'm so thankful for my sport, my primary sport, which is field hockey, which is within the United States, predominantly women. I think what you raise here is a little bit of what I was trying to get at earlier, which is not necessarily just the difference between men's sport and women's sport, but sport that is a cared for space and sport that is maybe less cared for. When we talk about desegregated sport, or when I talk about a different imaginary of sport, it is simply a healthier, more balanced sports space. You know, I think when we talk about it too, we have to talk about this as, we're not saying, hey, let's just desegregate all sport right now. But what we are saying is, let's imagine what sport could look like. And trans athletes open that door inherently for us to ask, what could this look like? What could a healthy, safe, care-filled sports system look like, feel like, and what would be the result of that?
I think so many people turn towards women's sports because it is a more inclusive space, right? It's not as toxic as men. And although it definitely can be, but it has that feel to it. And that's why so many people want to be joining in on the women's sports front, because it is more inclusive, and to picture like a whole sport, everybody, men, women, and trans people included in those categories, non-binary people. I really love that piece of, can we imagine what that could look like? It would take quite a bit because we're so culturally ingrained, but yeah, that's awesome.
And I don't think this is a point that we raise in the book, but I always find it also ironic that people talk about, oh, we're protecting girls and women's sport by not allowing trans athletes. And I really think the people who might benefit most from trans athletes are little boys. To say that trans women are whatever people have said about them, what are we teaching little boys about what it means to be a woman?
That's right.
Right. So again, I just think we don't talk enough about the real harms of sport and who is being harmed. And I would argue boys are certainly being harmed by not having trans athletes in the mix.
And more different conversations, right? So anytime you see a blanket ban of all trans athletes at every age, at every level, at every state. Like we have to get super, super, super curious about that because again, sport is so nuanced, right? So there's a lack of imagination around this because we've been asking the wrong questions and having the wrong focus. I think about Kenny in the book is an ultimate Frisbee player. He, as a trans man, is having a better experience on a women's Frisbee team than he was having on a mixed Frisbee team because it's just a little bit of ABCD, right? Like just bodies moving, having fun, not having to pair so strictly with another body and count vaginas, right? It's just like, okay. And he's having a much better experience there because of the culture of that. We think about ultra running. The further you run, the less sex matters, right? And so there's all of these opportunities at all of these levels with all of these ages, all of these different stakes for us to drop that strict binary. And every moment you can do that, you have to believe it's going to get more interesting.
The end of the book highlights this idea of pathways to participation instead of bans. So can you talk a little bit more about like 2026 or next 5 years? What are some pathways to participation? How can we get away from who needs to be banned and move into more of like, how can we move more towards pathways to participation where everyone feels comfortable to be in sport?
So I think the first step, and this is a big one, is to step away from fear and scarcity. Now, I say that because I think when we're talking about trans athletes, we're often using cis girls and women as political cover to make decisions about trans folks and their bodies. The bottom line is we cannot keep invoking girls' safety while refusing to fund their programs, while refusing to protect them from the real threats to their safety, which I would argue are abuse from coaches and sports systems. Cis girls are not shields. They are athletes who deserve our support. So when people come to me and ask me questions about this topic, we were talking about how do you have that conversation with somebody who maybe doesn't align with my thinking on this or somebody else's thinking. I think, first of all, we need to address the reality that most people are afraid because of scarcity, because they feel like women's sport is scarce and that somebody is taking something from women's sport. And the reality is it's not trans athletes taking something from women's sport. It's the fact that women's sport has always been scarce because it's never been fully supported. So I think the second step is really to invest in conditions and systems that actually produce fairness and healthy sport. I think the last point I'll make is just we need to talk about what this moment is and what it's not. This is not about trans athletes in my mind. This is not about sport, right? This is about certain people wanting to control certain bodies. And I think we need to name that and say it explicitly.
Yeah. So getting really clear that the myths that are being used are working as they're designed to be working, and that we got to get a little fire in our bellies and get real clear about who's actually being harmed and get real clear that the myths are doing harm, that there are trans kids who are afraid to go out for sports because the myths exist, that the stories have taken hold even though they're not true. So whenever I'm having this conversation, I always bring up as a gymnast, Larry Nassar, the man who actually seriously harmed cis girls and women. I think every person has to find the fire in their belly in this issue. Like when it comes down to the base level, to me, this is about the fact that we hate women and we think women are inferior. I can find some fire there, right? When we're trying to pretend like trans athletes are doing harm, I believe the girls who called out Larry Nassar. He's the one doing harm, and you are not going to fool me, right? So it's like, where can you find the fire in your belly about what's really going on here and get super, super clear that there's harm being done, and it's not being done by trans athletes, it's being done to them. And that this story, the longer it perpetuates, the more harm it's going to do, and have better conversations that have actual trans athletes at the table.
In the book, you had some statements about trans athletes, and then you encouraged the reader, like, how did that feel in your body? And what felt sticky. And I just think that's such a great reminder too of we might have knee-jerk reactions, and to explore those a little bit more and get curious about them can go an extremely long way.
Often our protective strategies are really beautiful and they're there for a reason, and we can outgrow them, right? It's not our fault that the stories from the GOP policymakers and the media are so pervasive. It is our responsibility to notice when we cling, when we grasp, when we tighten up, when we clench our jaw. Why? Turn toward it, get curious about it. And that's where the stakes are. We're not talking about other people. In doing this work, I got more free. And so now I can bring a calm nervous system to the conversation, which is an asset. But I had to dig through my stories to get there. And that's good work. And it's exciting work. And that shifts that then. It's like the working title of our book was Let Them Play. Do you hear the assumption of who has the power in that? It hurts my stomach. So just recognizing that there's certain people who are making decisions about other people when it comes to something as basic as play. And that's where we have to talk about money and race as well, because I want a world where kids have time to play. All kids have access to play. All kids have access to facilities to play, right? That is kind of where I start to get a little fired up and where it gets interesting. So it's not just about letting trans kids play. It's about realizing in these interviews how embodied folks are because they've done that excavation work to come out as trans, and they have access to joy in a way that I'm curious about and want more of, that could actually lead us into a more beautiful future.
If that doesn't get our listeners to be curious and read this book, I don't know what will. So I really hope people take something away from that. Thank you both. Thank you for the time and for writing the book. A few questions that we ask our interviewees to wrap up our interviews. One being a more fun one is, who is your favorite athlete in women's sports and why?
I have to go and say Simone Biles. She's amazing. And I want to nerd out for a second. I was trained as a gymnast in the era of the perfect 10, where little tiny prepubescent white girls were trained to be perfect and play small. Like you made your routine worth a 10, but as easy as possible worth a 10. And then you just repped it until you could do it perfectly. Shifting the system of women's gymnastics allowed Simone Biles to explode and be the greatest we've ever seen, where you get awarded for being bigger and taking up more space, being bigger with your tricks, right? And so now you see the Olympic team being almost exclusively women of color and almost exclusively women, right? And so then think about what the little girls are seeing compared to what I saw growing up and the trajectory of that sport. So I love her because she's the GOAT. And I also love her story in the fact that the system shifted so that she could thrive, and really thinking about that in terms of other sports as well.
Mine is not as serious. Mine is Kelsey Mitchell. She plays for the Fever. And first of all, I have to say that she is an incredible athlete, and I think that she was underrated all last season. The Fever were plagued with injuries. She knows how to show up when it matters. Now, okay, she's a great athlete. Fine. The truth is, I saw her at the grocery store once. And she was buying turkey, and we made eye contact, and she smiled, and I immediately swooned. And then I turned bright red and I think I blacked it out. I don't know what happened after that. I couldn't say anything. I just walked away. So yeah, she has a great smile, and
That's so real.
I'm sweating just thinking about it.
I really wish I were more poised in those moments.
No way.
But yeah, no, the gay panic is real. I was like, oh my God, she's smiling. Oh my God. So, yep, love her.
We love that.
That's amazing. And then to round us out, how can people support both of you? Where can they follow you?
Okay, my website is my name, ellieroscher.com, and my social media handle is my name, @Ellie Roscher. And we would love to have you join in and deepen the conversation.
My Insta is Dr. Baeth, PhD. And my website is also my name. I think the greatest gift somebody could do is to buy the book and to pass it on. Pass it on to somebody who wants to or needs to read it, or somebody who can get more curious about this.
And also to follow Chris Mosier, who wrote our foreword and interviewed our youth and is an amazing human. And the book would not exist without him. So he's on our team. Follow him first, actually. And then us second and third if you want.
That's great. And we will drop a link to both of your socials and a link to buy the book. We cannot say thank you enough to the both of you for joining us today. That wraps up our interview today. Be sure to purchase Fair Game and follow Ellie and Baeth on social media. That is it for this week. We will see you next week on Women's Sports Weekly. In the meantime, watch women's sports, rate and subscribe to the pod on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, and share the podcast with your friends. Thanks for joining us.